Hi, welcome. All right, yes, I'm going to be talking about designing dictatorships. This is something I've been thinking about for quite some time and I've been making games about and researching about as well. A little bit about me before we get started. I am a graduate of the NYU Game Center MFA program. I graduated from there last year. So one of the things we'll talk about today is my thesis game. I have also taught at NYU. I've taught game studies, so kind of more on the theoretical side of things. And then I have also taught most recently at Montclair State University, doing programming and design for games. And yeah, so I teach, I make games, I do a lot of research, and that's most of what I want to focus on today. So I'm going to get started. I love when the slides work. Okay, so we're going to start with a quick introduction to the two games I'm going to talk about. The first one is Quantum Ties. That was my thesis game at the NYU Game Center. And then the second one is Silencer. That started out as my friend's thesis game at the Game Center. And then I later joined the game and I've done some work on it as well. And because we both worked in these games at the same time and there's a lot of kind of content overlap and research overlap, I'm going to kind of present them both because one of them is a digital game, one of them is an analog game. So we have kind of an example of each. And then I'm going to talk about the different research topics that we kind of engaged with throughout the process of making these games and the processes, like how we came about this information, and then the result of that research, how we implemented it into the design of our game, specifically by looking at the diegetic rules, and I'll give you a better definition of that later, and how we built the world of our narratives through that, and then how we got people to follow and break the rules. So, first game, Quantum Ties. So it is a role-playing, social deduction-ish game is kind of how I describe it. It started out as more of like a parlor LARP type situation, if you're familiar with that format of games. 7 players in a room for 3 hours. Like you play the whole game kind of in that one sitting. It evolved a little bit since then. There are elements of social deduction in it. If you're familiar with social deduction games like the classic like Werewolf, right? There's a little bit of that in there, but it's not quite the same. So it kind of sits at the intersection of different types of analog gameplay. And it kind of tries to create a core mechanic around the idea of giving and breaking trust. So you and these other 6 people are trying to create trust bonds with each other that are symbolized by tying ribbons around each other's wrists. Every character has a ribbon color, and as you're role-playing your characters, as you form a trust bond with someone, you tie your color ribbon around their wrist to signify that. And then sometimes that trust gets broken, and then you cut the ribbons in a ceremony of sorts. So that is kind of the core mechanic that you engage with throughout your role-playing. And it was originally inspired by my experience growing up in a high-control religious organization that shall remain unnamed. But yeah, so I came into the Game Center already having made some like work in my studio art undergrad, dealing with some of these topics, and I wanted to deal with them through kind of gameplay and role-playing to, kind of explore those topics more. And then finally, my kind of goal for it was to highlight how authoritarian or regimes, other institutions, or high control groups impact the relationships between members. What does it mean when you're all members under an authoritarian group like that, and how does that impact how you interact with each other, how you trust each other or don't trust each other, that kind of a thing. Then the second game is Silencer. So this is designed by Diane Wang, who's my friend from my cohort, my co-worker, colleague, collaborator. It is a bureaucratic simulation game where the player works as a news censor. This was in this last year's run of the NYU Incubator, which is when I joined the game as a producer, editor. I've also just kind of been on it as like a sounding board from the very like inception of it. So I've been along for the entire ride. And it's specifically inspired by Diane's experience of watching her mother work in and be ousted from Chinese news media, and kind of watching her mother go through that process and seeing the impact of censorship and news media on her mother's career in Chinese news. And it was specifically intended to kind of highlight the gradual process of how rules that might start off very kind of simple very quickly snowball into stricter and stricter crackdowns, stricter and stricter rules, where you end up with increasingly strict censorship and the complicity of the news censor within that, the role of the person who has to actually be a part of enforcing those rules, which is who you play as in this game. You are the news censor in this game. Some screenshots here, so you get kind of an idea how it works. You get a little article on the side that you have to read. You have your little emails in the bottom right corner where you get kind of messages from various NPCs. Top right corner is the handbook, and we're starting off with a very simple rule here. The national flag of Ogalia, the country you're in, has to be displayed properly. Like, very easy, nothing crazy, right? We'll see later how that goes south very quickly. And then all you do is you pull a lever, censor it or pass it, right? So kind of an idea how that game works. All right, so what is the research I did for Quantum Ties? I have a little bit of a background in psychology, and so I kind of went back to like my old psychology roots in undergrad, and I went into a lot of kind of research on psychology, sociology, about thought reform and control, and how high control groups kind of manipulate their member base. One particular idea that I engaged with a lot is Robert Lifton's ideological totalism. He first came up with this idea in like the 60s, but he's since reworked it in a book from 2019 that I'll go into a little bit more detail on later. But ideological totalism is kind of this idea. He lists these 8 hallmarks of extremist meeting grounds, like 3 hallmarks of extremist environments that can breed kind of this totalist control over the member base. For example, he lists one as milieu control, which is control over communication with both the outside world and between members inside the group. And so he goes through kind of these kind of 8 hallmarks, and I'll explain a little bit more later how I implemented some of those specifically in my world building. If you're familiar with 1984, also great book, highly recommend it. It was something that's like an example of fiction that I looked at for inspiration as well. Also, the idea of the telescreen in that is an example of milieu control, where the telescreen is kind of a device that controls communication, between people in the group, or even just with yourself. Milieu control can also be about controlling how you communicate with yourself, or whether you're able to at all, right? And then I did a lot of research on obedience. How do institutions get obedience and compliance? Milgram's experiments, a lot of you probably heard of before. A very famous research on that. This is the experiment where people had to administer shocks to another person, or at least they thought they were administering shocks, electric shocks. And the idea behind it is, how easy is it pretty much to get people to follow instructions? I tell them, push the button, send that shock out, and will they do it? And then some more modern research, because Milgram was, and the time of like the 1960s and 70s were like a lot of very like questionable research like this was happening, and there's some more kind of modern, explorations of that that I looked at as well. And finally, handbooks and codes of conduct, because one of the big things that I wanted to think about was, how do I explain this behavior of how cults get to where they are before they get to the extreme point. When a lot of people think about kind of cults, they think about like the extremes of, murders, mass suicides, like the very like taken to the extreme. But I didn't want to make a game that was also just like, haha, evil cultist, right? And I wanted to kind of show how some of these techniques could look in a much lower stakes environment. So this is from the 2012 original Valve Handbook for New Employees. Not saying that Valve is a cult, I am not making that claim. However, they have a lot of these illustrations in it, and it stood out to me because it is a very simple breakdown of a very standardized process, which is kind of used to get a lot of people to do things all the same way, right? I'm sure we all know that there are many, many different ways that you could talk to a coworker and figure out what's going on around you, but Valve says there are 4 steps to do an order just this exact way. Talk to someone in a meeting first, talk to someone in the elevator, then talk to someone in the kitchen, and finally talk to someone in the bathroom, and that's how you find out what's going on. So this idea of standardization to get obedience. And then for Silencer, Diane originally did a lot of interviews with journalists about their experiences navigating news censorship in China. She reached out to a lot of her mother's old connections and people who went through kind of those same experiences at the same time as her mother did, including one of her mom's former coworkers actually was jailed for when the government took over the newspaper and let a lot of people go. He was actually put in jail for things that the newspaper had published, and so she wanted to learn as much about those different experiences as she could and get real world anecdotes about it. And then she also did a lot of historical research on how actual real world governments have used censorship techniques in the past. Both in China, which is her big example that she's looking at, and then also looking at totalitarian propaganda used in Nazi Germany and then later in the German Democratic Republic, former East Germany. And a lot of that she also got from the book Bending Spines, which was a very important reference for her. That was actually recommended by one of the Chinese journalists she talked to as something to look at for like eerie parallels. And so she focused a lot on how these patterns have been repeated throughout the 20th century in her research. So a lot of focus on kind of historical perspectives. Now that we kind of know what the research was, I'm going to talk about what diegetic rules are, or at least how I think of them in the context of these two games. So there are rules, guidelines, laws, whatever you want to call them. In my game, in Quantum Ties, it's called the Codex. That exist within the world of the game. They were created by the fictional authorities in the game. So in Silencer, there is the country of Ogalia, and Ogalia has a government, and the government of Ogalia says, these are our censorship laws. When we talk about rules in games, this can get confusing, right? Because we have rules that kind of govern how the framework of the game works usually, right? But when we use the word rules for that, it can get a little confusing when we're talking about here specifically rules that exist within the fiction of the game. But this was very important to us that we had these rules, not just as they're not outside of the narrative. They're not here, player, are the rules that you have to follow. Now go play the game. You are introduced to these rules as the character that you're playing as you're going through the game. And it actually helped us provide an entry point for players into our world building. In Quantum Ties, there is a part of the game at the beginning where the list of rules is set, but each new group of players, after they get their character sheets, they actually sit together as a group in character, and they flesh out what these rules mean. In this specific instance of the game, when they're playing it, what do these rules mean for them as the characters in the world? And so in this way, the rule set is kind of this transitional object. I got you, Clara. That allows for entry into the fictional world because it allows the players who see the rules before they get their character sheets to then go into character and interpret the rules for what they mean to them in character in the world. In Silencer, the rules as they get added and as they change throughout the game actually illustrate changes in like the state of the world. So as certain political events happen throughout the course of the game, rules are updated to reflect that. Sometimes they foreshadow things that will happen. And so as the world is changing around you, those rule sets change with you. And so in that way, you very clearly see the choices that you make as the character reflected not only through the events that you read about, but actually through additional requirements that you have to fulfill as the character, as your job gets more and more demanding. A little funny example of this is the dog urine story. This is always a hit when we show this at conventions. So there's this article that you get pretty early on. At the point when you get it, the only rule you have is the first one. You start the game with just this one rule. And there's no rule against anything in this article. People are like, I really want to censor this, but there's no rule against it, so I guess I have to pass it. As soon as that article gets passed, or sometimes censored, depending on what people decide, as soon as you move past that article, you actually get an email from one of the NPCs. And in that email, they say, I noticed you just received an article that seemed really strange, but since it didn't violate any protocols, we couldn't flag it as having any violations. But anyways, this type of information is blatantly wrong and potentially harmful. I'll see what I can do about it. The next day you come back to work, suddenly you have a second censorship rule added. We now have a list of legitimately recognized publishers, and we can only pass articles that come from one of those publishers. So as you're passing this article, or as you come across this article, the NPCs in the world then kind of respond to you and says, wait a second, we should make some changes based on that. And so that is reflected in the rules as they get added on and as they appear throughout the game. I'm going to show you an example of the codex from Quantum Ties. So like I said, these 7 rules, you have this. This is part of kind of the booklet that is the game. And this is always the same. This is what every player sees, and then also what every character sees. But on top of what is just written, as the characters come together to have a meeting at the beginning of the game, they kind of build these out together. So every playthrough of the game is slightly different because the characters bring their own kind of views and opinions based on, their backstories to interpreting these rules. And so not only does it change how the game runs a little every time, but it allows the characters to be important in the co-creation of the world. So how do we get people to follow the rules? My original concern was these rules are really strict. No one's going to want to follow them. Or people might just want to be contrarian about it and say, no, I'm not doing anything. So we thought about how we could kind of encourage people and train them to follow the rules. In both games, following the rules is framed as a show of loyalty to the authority. And that is made very clear in Quantum Ties, the backstories that the characters have. Each character has a small little booklet with like 2 paragraphs of backstory, nothing crazy long, but a little bit of backstory that also tells you as the player kind of how your character, at the beginning of the game at least, feels about the authority, feels about the rules, and things like that. And what their motivation is for following or not following the rules. In Silencer, you are the censor, and from the very beginning, we set it up as like, the first email you get is, welcome, you finally found a job. We're happy to have you at the censorship office. So we set up the expectation that, A, it's very hard to find a job in this world, so you probably don't want to screw this one up. Got to keep your job. And then as you go along through the game, there's more and more pressure on you as the censor to really follow these rules. You get to a point where, if you decide to start breaking the rules, maybe it'll have a bad effect on your parents because the government knows where your family lives, and things like that, where these pressures start building up. And so we try to establish very early on in both games the pattern that following the rules is showing loyalty. It will keep you safe. It is what you're expected to do. And in that way, kind of teach this pattern of behavior. When I talk about the character frame and the player frame, what I really mean is in the world of the game, you as the character are positioned as someone who, is expected to follow these rules. In the player frame, you as the player, you're operating a little differently. And I'll get more into the theory of where this is coming from in just a second. But for now, just keep in mind the idea that your character is expected to follow the rules in kind of the story of the world. And you as the player have nothing really forcing you to follow these rules, but we're slowly teaching you that pattern of behavior that as a player, you're expected to, pull that censor lever. By doing what is expected of the character, you as the player are getting in the flow of also following those rules. In Quantum Ties, the rules are very simple. They don't change throughout the game. They're there from the very beginning. And what it does is it gives you a very easy checklist. So it makes it very easy for you to just say, check, I followed that rule, check, I followed that rule. We want to make it wanted to make it as easy as possible to see, this is the good thing to do, this is the bad thing to do. That way, it makes it much easier to, again, get into this pattern of obedience. I'm talking about that a lot because obedience, I found out doing my research, is very much a learned pattern of behavior, right? A lot of institutions will start you off with those very simple rules to get you used to following those commands, those instructions, that when the more intense rules, the bigger asks come out, you're already so used to just saying yes or going along with it and being obedient that you're much more likely to go along with the bigger asks, right? That's also what Milgram's experiments were about, right? You start with very small electric shocks and then they up the voltage more and more. But because you're just so used already with the low voltage shocks to say, yeah, I'll press the button, by the time they tell you you're administering like a deadly amount of electricity to this person, you're not actually. It's all a trick. But by the time they tell you and the participants actually believe that you're administering this like deadly amount of electricity, they're so in that state of just saying yes that they'll just kind of go along with it. And then in Silencer, kind of similar, except here we do it by starting off with just like one rule at the beginning, and then slowly another one gets added, and that one's also still very simple to follow. Then another one gets added, and then later on you have 10, 20 rules, some of them very extreme, big asks. But you're just doing what you've been doing all along. You're just so in that pattern, right? So an example of how I specifically designed the rules of quantum ties to encourage that. There are 3 examples here of Lifton's like 8 deadly sins of ideological totalism. The first one is mystical manipulation. The dominion, the authority in quantum ties, and the crones, their kind of mysterious representatives, are presented as these mystical higher powers or chosen ones. Lifton talks about that the community of the cult has the mystical chosen one to kind of gather around. So by addressing that, especially in terms of loyalty, criticism of the dominion, I gave the characters to have that essential mystical power to focus around. Then the demand for purity. This is the big one in terms of the easy checklist. A lot of high control environments will leave no room for morality outside of what leadership says is good and true. There's this idea that there's an absolute good of like the absolute correct thing that aligns with totalist ideology, of course. Like they want to make sure that their ideology is seen as the only good thing you can do and everything else is bad. And so by giving this very easy checklist and just saying, these are the 7 things, if you feel like those, we're not asking that much of you, just 7 things, but those are the ultimate rules of our dominion. You're giving people this very easy checklist to look out for in other people's behaviors to be able to check for, are they being pure or not, right? And then finally, loading the language by exerting control over which concepts can be discussed. You try to express this facade of unity and but also have exclusion, obviously, right? So by allowing certain words to be used, certain topics to be discussed, you can kind of unify the group behind that. And anyone who doesn't know that language or anyone who discusses topics other than what is allowed, they're very clearly marked as an outsider. So it's a very clear way of creating an us versus them kind of dichotomy. And that very like black and white thinking, us versus them, either or thinking is very common in these high control groups and was something that we ended up kind of making very building the games around in early playtests. That was very common in early versions of both of these games, that it was very like all or nothing, yes or no. And it worked very well. in Silencer, here's an example of, start off with one rule, and then a few work days later, you're already on rule number 5, where religion can't be criticized anymore, right? So you're kind of starting to see that snowball effect. And then here's an example of a postmortem where if you incorrectly censor an article, you have to copy the little message as punishment. However, it never keeps you from playing the game. Violating any of these protocols is specifically a thing that happens in character. It never like makes you lose the game as the player. And this is important because we're going to look at Fine's player frames, or people player character frames. So Gary Allen Fine is a sociologist who looked at TTRPGs to study this and came up with this theory that when you're playing a role-playing game, I'm going to imply it to Silencer as well. It's technically not a role-playing game, but I'm going to make a case for it. You exist in the people frame, right? Everyone exists in the people frame. We're people all the time. And there are certain rules that we think that apply to us in the people frame, right? There are certain like morals we have, certain thoughts that we have. Certain patterns that we follow. We exist in this frame all the time. Then when we play a game, we enter into the player frame. Now we accept that there are certain rules, game mechanics, frameworks that we have to follow. For example, this could be like, if I don't know, get a score of 10 before the other player, I win the game. That's a rule that only applies in the player frame, right? In real life, in the people frame, if I get a score of 10, nothing happens to me. I unfortunately can't just do well at a game and succeed at life. But in the player frame, you can, right? If you do well, there's a reward, or there is whatever game outcome, right? And then the character frame, these are rules, ideas that apply to the character that you are inhabiting within the game, right? So it exists within the player frame. You're simultaneously a person with thoughts and morals and things. And then at the same time, you're also a player when you're playing the game. And then at the same time, you're also a character when you're in character. So Quantum Ties, because it's an analog role-playing-ish game, kind of the type of game that this theory was originally made for. But in Silencer, even though you're not role-playing in the traditional sense that you would in like a TTRPG, you still make choices in character. You still develop a certain character morality as you go through the game, because as you're presented with different options of who to side with which NPCs to believe, you are still kind of co-creating that character that you play as and kind of developing that character's mindset in the character frame. The reason that this is important is because we're constantly navigating between all three of these frames, right? I could be playing Silencer and say, as a person in my people frame, I disagree with censorship, right? But then at the same time, I'm playing a character who might say, oh, I love this government and this censorship, right? And I'm constantly navigating between that. This became important when it got to breaking the rules, because we tried so hard to get people to follow the rules. We assumed that that would be the hard part. We assumed everyone would want to just do whatever they want, break the rules. They didn't. What we tried to do, the techniques we learned during our research, worked a little bit too well. And early playtests of both of these games had a lot of players who just went through the game playing their characters in a way where they never wanted to break any rules, which is tricky because the moment that we're trying to get to in both of these games is, what do you feel? What do you think about? How does it change your perception of the world when you finally do break those rules, right? How does that shift how you understand the space that you've been playing and working in, the narrative you've been engaging in? What happens in that moment of breaking the rules, facing that punishment, right? But that can't happen if people don't want to break the rules. So we had to walk it back a lot. We had to figure out ways to encourage people to break the rules after we did such a good job making them obedient. And there are kind of three things that we settled on. The first one is, neither of these games have win conditions. I talked earlier kind of about the idea of purity and the ultimate good. And by removing win conditions, we removed from the player frame the idea that there is an ultimate good. In the character frame, that still exists, right? Our characters are still being told by their authority, there's the only one correct thing you can do. But from the player frame, from kind of the mechanics of the game, we remove the idea of you can do a correct thing to win the game, or you can do a correct thing to achieve your goal to win the game, right? Because what we needed to do is distinguish more between what players understood to be in the character frame, or people understood to be in the character frame, and what they understood to be in the player frame. When they had these rules that existed in the world of the game, people automatically assumed that they were also mechanical rules in the player frame, because as players of games, we're so used to having to follow rules. The games, I've come to kind of realize, have a little bit of authoritarianism in them, right? We're being told these are the rules. If you don't follow them, like, the game doesn't work, right? And so because people are so used to that, they had a hard time distinguishing between what rules exist just in the world of the game, the diegetic rules, and which rules did they have to follow as players for the game to function. So we removed win conditions to remove that temptation a little bit. Then we really tried to walk it back and avoid binary choices. This was more of an issue with Silencer early on, because you very much see the original choices, censor or do not censor, right? So Diane and I had a lot of talks about how do we make this be less about either or. And the answer was to provide many, many different motivations for making that either or choice, because that censor do not censor choice is not just going to go away. But instead of having it just be like my own personal morals versus what the government wants from you, it became, what does the government want from me? What would be best for my parents? What would be, there's a guy bribing me to not censor certain articles. Maybe I just want money, right? There are all these different motivations to make that either or choice more complex, to remove that kind of that binary good or bad idea from the engagement with the game. And then finally, we provided narrative motivations and rewards for breaking the rules. So in Silencer, that's certain NPC messages that you can only get when you break the rules, certain kind of plot lines that you can only get to after choosing to not censor an article that the government wants you to censor, right? This is Birdie. He's the guy who'll end up bribing you. In Quantum Ties, it comes more as a reward in terms of getting to have an extra scene. When you break a rule, you get publicly accused of that, you get sent to this kind of punishment, and it being kind of a scene-based role-playing situation, you get to have that moment. You get to then, as a reward, while you're being punished, but have that moment of developing your character more and having that extra scene. There's an example here of like the ribbon cutting after trust was broken. And so, by making these relationships with people, screwing them over, breaking their trust, or breaking the rules for someone else to lose trust in you, you then get to have that moment of engaging in that kind of ritual. So we're at the end. Summary. Implementing research in our world building to elicit specific player behaviors, very effective. So especially obedience research and figuring out how people are manipulated and controlled. It worked very well because it works very well in the real world. So implementing that took us very far, but it took us too far because players couldn't distinguish between what they were expected to do as players and then when they entered character, what they were supposed to do as characters, and ended up not wanting to break the rules. And then we had to find the balance between designing diegetic rules to encourage obedience, but not going so far that people would lose that moment of like that wake up moment of like, oh no, I broke the rules. What does this mean for me now? Like, how does this shift my perception? So that's it. You can email me here.